The first time I stepped into his living room, I felt an immediate sense of comfort, something I hadn't expected, considering the nature of my visits was supposed to be purely professional, confined to the safe walls of a therapist's office. The room was cozy and inviting, bathed in the soft glow of a table lamp that highlighted the warm tones of the bookshelves lining the walls. Leather-bound books stood neatly in rows, their spines hinting at decades of knowledge, wisdom, and experience. A thick, patterned rug covered the wooden floor, muffling my footsteps as I walked across it. He sat there, a man in his late 50s with a calm presence that made you forget the world outside. His hair, a distinguished mixture of silver and black, framed a face that carried both gentleness and quiet authority. There was a sense of wisdom in the way he observed the room, the way his fingers lingered briefly on the arm of the couch before settling, as though every motion was deliberate. I noticed his eyes, kind, attentive, and perceptive, the kind that could see right through the layers I so carefully constructed around myself. I had come to his home on the pretext of a casual conversation, a social courtesy after meeting him briefly through my therapist. But there was an undercurrent of curiosity I couldn't ignore. Every detail in the room seemed carefully chosen, yet effortlessly comforting. The way the afternoon light filtered through the sheer curtains, casting a soft glow over the furniture, made the space feel intimate, almost protective. There was a quiet elegance here that mirrored him, thoughtful, calm, yet impossible to ignore. As he gestured for me to sit, I found myself momentarily distracted by the scent of old books and polished wood. It wasn't just the room, it was his presence that commanded attention. The comfort was different from any therapy session I had attended. It wasn't clinical. It wasn't about structured conversation or probing questions. Instead, it felt personal, subtle, yet dangerously engaging. I realized in that moment how easy it would be to cross boundaries, how easily the warmth of this space and the gentleness of this man could draw someone in. I took a seat, my hands resting nervously on my lap. He smiled, an expression that was at once reassuring and knowing, as if he recognized more than I intended to reveal. That evening, the lines between curiosity, admiration, and something far more complicated began to blur. The room, the atmosphere, and the man himself created a tension I hadn't anticipated, a magnetic pull that promised comfort but hinted at something forbidden. By the time I left, I was acutely aware of one thing. This was no longer just a casual encounter. I had stepped into a world that felt safe, intimate, and dangerously close to something I wasn't supposed to explore. And yet, as I walked down the quiet street toward my car, I couldn't shake the thought that I would return, drawn again by the warmth of the room and a man who seemed impossible to ignore. I sat across from him, my hands twisted in my lap, unable to decide whether to clasp them together or let them rest loosely on the arm of the chair. The room around us was quiet, warm, and softly lit, but the atmosphere felt charged, like an invisible current ran between us, subtle yet undeniable. I had convinced myself that this was merely a polite visit, a casual conversation outside the confines of my therapy sessions. Yet the closer I got, the more aware I became of a strange tension that I couldn't explain. He looked at me with a calm, measured gaze, the kind of look that made you feel simultaneously exposed and understood. There was a depth in his eyes, the kind that suggested he could see not just the surface of a person, but the intricate layers underneath, the fears, the insecurities, the hidden desires. It was unsettling, in a way, how easily his presence disarmed me. I felt like a fragile glass figurine, sitting nervously while he examined every crack and imperfection without judgment. I tried to focus on small details to keep my mind occupied, the faint scent of cedar from the wooden shelves behind him, the soft hum of the ceiling fan, the way sunlight caught on the edges of the books and furniture. But every time I did, my attention wandered back to him. His posture was relaxed, almost casual, yet there was an underlying authority that made it impossible to ignore him. Even the slight tilt of his head as he listened, the subtle movements of his fingers resting on the arm of the chair, seemed deliberate, drawing me further into the moment. I could feel my pulse quicken, a mix of nervousness and an inexplicable curiosity. My thoughts spiraled as I tried to maintain composure, yet the air between us seemed charged with unspoken words. Every glance, every subtle shift in position, felt like it carried meaning I wasn't supposed to understand. I realized that my fascination with him was growing, quietly but insidiously, as if I were falling into a pattern I had no control over. At one point, our hands almost brushed, a fleeting moment that made my heart skip. I quickly moved mine back, chastising myself for letting my nerves betray me. But the warmth of that near touch lingered, and with it came a dangerous awareness. The boundary I had promised myself to uphold was slipping. He didn't reach for my hand, and yet the tension remained, suspended in the space between us like a fragile thread ready to snap. As the conversation continued, I became increasingly aware of how the ordinary setting of a room, a chair, a simple exchange of words, could transform into something charged and intimate. I knew, deep down, that I was treading a line I wasn't supposed to cross. And yet, the allure of his presence, the comfort of his attention, made it nearly impossible to resist leaning in, emotionally, mentally, dangerously close. By the end of the visit, I left with my mind spinning, heart racing, and a lingering sense that something profound and forbidden had begun in those few hours. I wasn't sure where the line was anymore, but I knew I had stepped closer to it than ever before. It was a fleeting moment, almost imperceptible, yet it carried a weight I couldn't ignore. Our hands brushed accidentally, a light, tentative contact that sent an unexpected shiver through me. The soft lighting of the room caught the curve of his fingers and the delicate contours of mine, highlighting a closeness that should never have existed. For a second, time seemed to slow, and the air between us thickened with a tension that was equal parts thrilling and terrifying. I withdrew my hand slightly, though not quickly enough to erase the warmth that lingered where our skin had met. My mind raced, a jumble of thoughts and warnings. This is wrong. It's dangerous. Keep your distance. And yet, every instinct in me fought against retreating. There was something magnetic about the contact, something that drew me closer despite my better judgment. I couldn't look away, couldn't stop noticing the subtle trembling in his hand, the brief hesitation before he pulled back. It was as if he, too, felt the weight of that moment. The fragile line we were teetering on, the silent acknowledgement of an attraction we weren't supposed to explore. The room around us seemed to fade, the background dissolving into soft shadows as the focus narrowed onto our hands. Every detail became magnified. The warmth of his skin, the gentle calluses on his fingers, the way the light reflected off the smooth surface of the table nearby. I could feel my pulse quickening, my breath catching in small, shallow bursts. There was an intimacy in that simple brush, a connection that bypassed words, a message carried purely through touch. It was brief, almost trivial, yet it left a mark far deeper than I could have anticipated. I forced myself to pull my hand fully back, placing it in my lap and pretending nothing had happened. But the memory of that fleeting contact lingered, a quiet ache beneath the surface. Even as we continued our conversation, my awareness of him sharpened. Every subtle movement, every shift in posture magnified by the knowledge of what had just occurred. It was a dangerous closeness, a magnetic pull that I knew I should resist, but found myself powerless against. For a moment, I wondered if he was aware of the same tension, the same silent electricity that crackled in the space between us. There was a fleeting glance, almost imperceptible, that suggested he too felt it. A mutual recognition, unspoken yet undeniable, that had the power to change the dynamic forever. By the time I left the room, my hands still tingled from the brief contact, and my thoughts were consumed by the memory of that simple, accidental brush. It was a moment so small, yet it had the power to unravel boundaries, to stir desires and curiosities I wasn't ready to confront. I realized then that closeness wasn't just about words or intentions. It could be carried in a touch, a fleeting connection that lingered far longer than the moment itself. And in that realization, I sensed both the thrill and the danger of getting too close. The photograph sat on the mantel, framed in delicate gold that had dulled slightly with age, its edges worn from years of handling. It depicted a family in the soft haze of memory, a younger version of him, my therapist's father, standing proudly in the center, flanked by a woman and two children, all smiling, their faces radiating warmth and happiness. There was something about the image that immediately caught my attention, something deeper than nostalgia. It was as if I could feel the echoes of laughter, the subtle intimacy of shared lives frozen in that single frame. I found myself drawn to it, unable to look away. The photo wasn't just a glimpse into his past. It was a window into a part of him I hadn't yet seen. The life he had lived before I ever existed in it. The moments that shaped his personality, his demeanor, and perhaps the gentle authority that drew me in so irresistibly. In that photograph, he was different yet the same. The warmth in his eyes, the curve of his smile, the way he held himself, it all felt familiar, as if I had always known him in some unspoken way. I reached out instinctively, my fingers hovering just above the frame. There was a magnetic pull, a strange desire to touch not just the photograph, but the memories it held, to connect with a version of him that was untouchable yet profoundly human. The frame reflected the soft glow of the lamp nearby, casting gentle highlights on the faces in the photo and accentuating the warmth that radiated from it. I could almost imagine the sounds behind the picture, the soft murmur of family chatter, the creak of floorboards under little feet, the quiet reassurance of a father's presence. It struck me then how much of a life existed outside the boundaries of our interactions, how much history and depth he carried with him that I had only glimpsed in fragments. The photograph symbolized more than just a family moment. It represented layers of his identity, the experiences that had molded him into the man sitting across from me, whose presence evoked emotions I hadn't intended to feel. There was a sense of intimacy, even intrusion, in observing it so closely, as if I were peeking into a private world that wasn't mine to inhabit. And yet, the more I looked, the more I felt a strange closeness. I imagined what it might have been like to be part of that scene, to share in the warmth, the laughter, the affection. It was intoxicating, almost dangerous, to feel drawn to someone through echoes of their past. The photograph became a mirror of my own desires, reflecting the curiosity, admiration, and forbidden longing that had been building silently between us. As I finally pulled back, my eyes lingered once more on the image. The smile in the photograph seemed to hold a knowing quality, a subtle reminder that life is layered, complex, and full of connections that defy reason. I left the room with the image etched in my mind, a reminder that closeness isn't only formed in shared moments. It can also be built through glimpses of a life lived, memories preserved, and the quiet pull of the heart towards someone who should remain just out of reach. The aroma of freshly brewed tea filled the room, mingling with the faint scent of polished wood and aged books. The soft glow from the nearby lamp created a cozy circle of light around the small table, where two cups sat, steaming gently, their warmth inviting and intimate. I sat opposite him, nervously tracing the rim of my cup with my fingers, acutely aware of the quiet rhythm of our breathing, the gentle rise and fall of his chest as he observed me with calm, measured attention. He reached across the table, not abruptly, not intentionally bold, but with a subtle ease that made the motion feel almost natural. Our hands hovered, fingertips brushing for just a moment, enough to send a quiet thrill through me. The contact was fleeting, delicate, but it carried an intimacy that words could never capture. In that small, almost accidental gesture, there was a message, attention, warmth, unspoken understanding. The steam rising from the teacups seemed to curl around us, enclosing us in a private cocoon where the world outside ceased to exist. I felt a rush of conflicting emotions. My rational mind warned me to pull away, to remember the boundaries that had always existed between us. Yet, my heart betrayed me, responding instinctively to the closeness, to the unintentional invitation in his gentle touch. There was a tension in the air, a quiet electricity that made it impossible to look anywhere else. Even the sound of the tea being stirred seemed amplified, a subtle soundtrack to the growing intimacy that neither of us dared to name. As we sipped, I noticed the slight tremor in my own hand, the heat of the cup mingling with the warmth of proximity. Every glance, every movement of his fingers across the table felt charged with meaning. The room seemed to shrink around us, the soft shadows on the walls framing us, as though we were the only two people in existence. It wasn't just tea. It was a ritual of closeness, a delicate dance that tread dangerously close to emotional territory neither of us had fully acknowledged. I wanted to speak, to break the silence that pulsed between us, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I focused on small gestures, the way he adjusted his cup, the slight incline of his head as he listened, the fleeting brush of our fingers. It was intimate in a way that was almost suffocating, yet deeply alluring, a quiet seduction that had nothing to do with overt declarations or physical closeness. The tension was in the space between us, in the subtleties of shared presence and silent understanding. By the time the tea was finished, I was acutely aware of how dangerous this closeness had become. A simple gesture, a hand reaching across, a brush of fingers, had stirred something I couldn't ignore. The warmth of the tea lingered, but so did the warmth of our connection, a silent acknowledgement of feelings too complicated and forbidden to name. As I rose to leave, I carried the weight of that moment with me, knowing that the boundaries had been subtly, irrevocably blurred. The study was a sanctuary of knowledge and quiet authority, lined with shelves of leather-bound books whose spines gleamed under the soft light of a desk lamp. The scent of old paper and polished wood hung in the air, a comforting yet slightly intoxicating mixture. I had come in under the pretense of curiosity, perhaps seeking advice, yet the very atmosphere of the room seemed charged with a subtle electricity I hadn't anticipated. Every object, every shadow seemed to draw me closer, not just physically, but emotionally. He leaned over my shoulder, a slight movement meant to point out a detail in a book I held, and for a brief moment, our bodies were impossibly close. The warmth of his presence pressed gently against my back, subtle yet unmistakable, creating a tension that was impossible to ignore. My fingers trembled slightly as I tried to maintain focus on the words in the book, yet every instinct in me was aware of him. His proximity, his scent, the quiet authority that radiated from him in waves. His voice, low and measured, guided me through the passage, but it was not just the content of his words that held my attention. It was the way he leaned in, the careful way he avoided overstepping, yet somehow managed to create a closeness that felt both comforting and dangerously intimate. The space between us seemed charged with unspoken meanings, each subtle gesture weighted with a tension I could neither name nor resist. I caught myself stealing glances at his profile, noticing the way the light highlighted the lines of his face, the gentle movement of his hands, the softness in his eyes as they lingered briefly on mine. I was acutely aware of the boundary I had promised to maintain, a line drawn firmly in my mind. Yet, in that study, surrounded by the quiet authority of books and the weight of his presence, the line felt almost irrelevant. My focus wavered between the text and him, my mind struggling to process the mix of admiration, curiosity, and something far more complicated that had begun to stir inside me. The closeness felt both natural and forbidden, like stepping into a room that existed only for the two of us, a world where rules didn't apply. The tension in posture, the subtle tilt of his body toward mine, the way his hand hovered near mine over the pages, was enough to awaken emotions I had tried to suppress. Every small gesture, every barely perceptible movement seemed loaded with significance. I realized then that intimacy wasn't always loud or overt. Sometimes it was the quiet nearness, the shared space, the electric charge that passed silently between two people. By the time he straightened and stepped back, the room seemed larger, yet somehow emptier. The words in the book no longer held the same importance. What lingered was the sensation of closeness, of being seen in a way that was dangerous yet intoxicating. I left the study with my mind swirling, acutely aware that the subtle tension in that room had changed everything. There was no turning back, at least not completely.